I don't have one. I'll give you her number. I'll give it to you. You guys can connect.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to begin. First of all, thanks for coming. We'll have others that are joining us shortly. And we have this piece of art in the middle of the room. So I'll kind of move around, and you won't mind, I'm sure, looking around that. My name is Byron Dorgan, and I am the creator and founder of the Center for Native American Youth. When I left the United States Senate after 30 years in the Congress, I had always worked on Native American issues, and I was wondering what might I do to continue that work, and one of the things I decided to do was focus on youth. They are our future. Native American youth are our future, and I have felt for a long, long while that this country has not done very well by those who were here first. We have, in many ways, cheated them and stolen from them, and it's a pretty sad situation. And when I say stolen, I mean stolen, because they owned the Black Hills, and of course the government took it away from them. And then they took $1 billion worth of gold out of the Black Hills to finance the Civil War, among other things. And so, look, this is a pretty tragic history. But the fact is, we have the capability to reverse some of that as well. And trying to deal with the issues and opportunities that exist for Native American youth is really, really important. Today we're releasing the second Native Youth Report, and I hope all of you have a copy of this or will get a copy of this. It describes what's happening with Native American youth, and although you know and I know that you can go in certain areas in this country where we have reservations and see Native Americans live and work, and there are some very difficult stories. I mean, the difficult unemployment is rampant in many areas, substance abuse, very significant violence. I mean, I can tell you stories that will keep you here for hours and hours. But our intent is to do more than that as well. Our intent at the Center for Native American Youth is to try to lift people up and to describe the inspirational things that other young people are doing that improve the lives of Native American youth. I'm determined to be a bearer of good news on a lot of things that matter, and I could tell you about Dakota Brown and so many people that I could just begin to describe to you, Native American youth out there who are making a really big difference for other Native Americans. And we're going to share all those stories with you throughout this year and years to come with something called the Champions for Change. We're bringing some of these remarkable young people here to become a part of what we do and then go out and become mentors to others in their community. There's this old saying that if you are not Native American, you're probably from somewhere else. Well, you're certainly from somewhere else, right, if you're not Native American. There's also an old proverb by an Indian chief who says, tell me a fact, and I will learn it. Tell me a truth, I will believe it. Tell me a story, it'll live in my heart forever. So the purpose of what we're trying to do here is tell some stories. And one of the things that I'm so anxious to do is to introduce you to Sari Horowitz, who is a master storyteller. And she's a writer that has won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. That's quite remarkable. 3 Pulitzer Prize winner. Sari, at the Washington Post, which is one of America's, probably America's premier newspaper from my standpoint, has done a good number of long, textured stories about what's happening on reservations, especially with Native American youth. Sometimes it's been hard to read them almost because it's about truth-telling. We've got a lot of challenges, just a lot of challenges. And so I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Sari. When I called Sari and asked her if she would come to say a few words at this event, she said she'd be happy to do that. And she wanted to bring her Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer with her, as a matter of fact, Nikki. And we're really pleased she's here as well. But without further introduction, let me introduce to you Sari Horowitz. Sari.
Good afternoon. Is this working? Okay. So I'm a longtime fan of Senator Dorgan's, and thank you for your kind words. I've seen how hard he's worked for decades and how committed he is, dedicated to making life better for youth in Indian country. So this is Nikki Kahn, to introduce you to her. And she, let's see, can we have the first photo? She came along on the journey that I took 3 years ago in Indian country, and I'm going to share that with you today. We're going to tell you about, she took this picture on Pine Ridge. We're going to tell you about the people we met and what we learned. So my journey in Indian country began 3 years ago on a freezing day. I was on the White Earth Nation in Minnesota, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a woman named Lisa Bruner of the Ojibwe people. So there are many stories, obviously, that you can tell in Indian country. But I covered the Justice Department for the Washington Post. I covered it then. And so I was there specifically for one story in February about a new law that I learned about covering the Justice Department. Obama had signed a new law, and Eric Holder, then the Attorney General, had pushed for this law. Congress had passed it. It was an amendment to the Violence Against Women Act. And so Lisa was telling me about how when she was a child, and let's see, this is Lisa right here on the freezing day. When she was a child, her mother was beaten and sexually abused by her boyfriend, who was white. And 20 years later, Lisa herself was beaten and sexually assaulted by her husband, who was non-Native. And I learned, working on this story, that an estimated 1 in 3 Native American women are assaulted or raped in their lifetimes. Really shocking, staggering figures. And 3 out of 5 experience domestic violence. But for decades, when a Native American woman had been assaulted or raped by a man who's non-Indian, she had little or no recourse. And Linda told me that she and her mother had no recourse. Lisa told me that she and her mother had no recourse. These men were not prosecuted because they were non-Native. And for the last 35 years, because of a Supreme Court decision, very famous decision, Indians could not prosecute non-Natives who committed acts of domestic violence against Native women on reservations. So President Obama had signed this law that for the first time would allow Indian tribes to prosecute non-Natives of certain domestic violence crimes. So we were talking about this at her kitchen table, and she told me about this, and I wrote the story. But then she said to me, you know what, there are so many other problems in Indian country. And as a Washington Post reporter, you should keep going. Don't stop with this one story. And so I went out to Phoenix, Arizona. This is because I heard that there was a conference. Senator Dorgan was actually at this conference. It was a task force that the Justice Department, again, I tied it to the Justice Department. That's how I got my editors to let me do this, is because I said the Justice Department is having a task force on violence against Native American youth, and I need to go hear what they have to say. But I quickly learned that the story was not that conference. The story was actually a little further away from the conference on the Gila River Indian Reservation, where I met this young woman, Tyler Owens, and her friend, Richard Stone. And they were working with other teenagers, doing something that most teenagers aren't working on, which was to address the high rate of suicide on her reservation. In fact, the tree in this picture, when she was a little girl, she told me that another little girl committed suicide on that tree, and later her father committed suicide. And so she, as a little girl, was not allowed to go into this area. It was sort of taboo, as was the whole subject of suicide. It was sort of shrouded in silence on the reservation. And she was taking a course through the local hospital on suicide prevention and how to spot the danger so she and her peers could help others. What I learned in doing this story is that Indian teenagers kill themselves at a rate 3 times the national average and 10 times the national average in some areas. And my story, which was really a lot about Tyler, also explored the historical reasons for the suicides and the sense of despair, what Senator Dorgan was talking about, and something that he talked to me about when I was doing the story that really directly was tied to what he called the trail of broken promises to American Indians. And he, in an interview, noted the treaties back to the 19th century that guaranteed but largely did not deliver health care, education, and housing. And he talked to me about the lack of urgency in this country to do anything about it. And so what was happening is that kids like Tyler and Richard were trying to help their own community. And I went to a meeting with Senator Dorgan on the Gila River Indian Reservation, and at the meeting, he and a justice official met with 15 kids, Tyler and 14 others. And he said to them, I don't know if you remember this, but he said, how many of you know a young person who has taken their life? And all 15 teenagers raised their hands. So when I was out in Arizona, I heard about another story. Not nearby, the Pascuyaki tribe, and I'm actually from Tucson, Arizona, so I heard about this, and I said to my editors, okay, I don't want to come back quite yet, because I want to go write about this story, which was this tribe had been given, they'd been chosen for this pilot project with the new law. 3 tribes were chosen to implement this law ahead of all the other tribes. And this is the law that was going to tackle domestic violence. This particular tribe had it's a beautiful setting, actually, but they are struggling with a lot of poverty, but they, believe it or not, had a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art courthouse and police complex. And so they were on their way to starting to implement this law. And I wrote about the first tribal judge in the country who would hear a criminal case against a non-Indian in 36 years on a reservation. And then I also saw firsthand what the barriers had been to prosecuting non-Indians on the reservation. My story starts out with the tribal police chief, a man named Michael Valenzuela, and he's driving me through the darkened desert streets of the reservation. He takes me to the edge, to a convenience store, Circle K convenience store, and he points to the spot beyond the reservation where his officers used to take the non-Indian men who battered Native American women. This is before the new law. And he said to me, quote, we would literally drive them to the end of the reservation and tell them to beat it. And I hope that they didn't come back that night. But he said, they almost always did. So they were really up against this barrier until this new law that was passed by Congress. So now these stories are starting to become a series in the Washington Post, sort of a stream of coverage, and I'm not working on much else at this point. And we're seeing really how policies coming out of Washington are operating on the ground. Policies emanating from the Justice Department, how they play out in Indian country. And along the way, we saw a lot of suffering, but we also saw very inspiring people who Nikki's going to tell you a little bit about in a minute. But as I kept doing these stories, everyone said to me, if you really want to see where there's not justice in Indian country, you need to go to Alaska. And so I talked my editors into letting me go to Alaska. And I went to this very remote village, Cake, Alaska. I went with a photographer and a videographer. It took us 21 hours to go by ferry. You've probably been there. And there had been a murder of a young girl in this village. And in a minute, Nikki's going to show you a video about this. And I'm going to read you the beginning of the story. Her body lay in the back entryway of the church for 11 hours after villagers called the Alaska State Troopers for help. She was a 13-year-old nicknamed Mac, who wore big red glasses and loved to dance. The native Tlingit girl had been beaten to death. No one knew who killed Mackenzie Howard that cold February night last year, and you're looking at, that's her mother. and people were terrified the killer was still in their midst. But in the remote community of Cake, Alaska, only accessible by air or boat, there was no law enforcement officer. Now think about that. No law enforcement officer. That meant no police to protect the community, cordon off the crime scene, preserve the evidence, and launch an investigation. The villagers had to wait for state troopers in Juneau, 114 miles away, to get there. So with no police and few courts of their own, most Alaska Native villagers rely on the state troopers. But there's only about one trooper per every million acres. Think about that. And then getting to these rural communities is often delayed because of the weather and how far they are. And in the minds of many Alaska Natives, the low priority placed on protecting the local tribes. So I'm going to show you a video that we made that further tells this story.
For a long time, I didn't know about her. Juneau tried to fix her up as best they could. Sent her to Anchorage to try to fix her up. They couldn't fix her up for us to be able to see again. We got to see her. It's bad. I was going to set up a corner, but then I 13-year-old Mackenzie Howard was beaten to death in a rock the size of a basketball in February 2013 in the remote village of Cake, Alaska, population 559, a place home to mostly Alaska Natives from the Dakota tribe. Like 75 other remote Alaskan villages, Cake had no law enforcement at the time. The village, which is only accessible by plane or boat, now has one village public safety officer, or UPSO, but he's not permitted to carry a firearm. After Mackenzie's body was found, it took state police officers 11 hours to find him in Juneau, 114 miles away.
What really got me was nobody came even after they had called the troopers and I talked to them. And I thought they were pulling somebody in. You know, they have the capability of flying a sight now here. I thought they'd be Earth light. But still, and that upsets me. When there's any fishing violation or hunting violation, they're here in full force over a dead end.
A spokeswoman for the Alaska State Troopers said, quote, "The response was made as swift as logistical possible."
But because there was no law enforcement, didn't mean that things were taken care of. People like Michael Joel and other men in the community had to step forward, be on security watch, and so law enforcement could come in.
Well, it was pretty intense because nobody knew who would have committed the crime. And it took them about 10 days to figure out who did it. They didn't help us patrol, but since that had police experience, we organized our own patrol because people were scared. It's just like living in, say, your neighborhood, wherever you come from, with no law officer. What's that feeling?
into rollovers on cars and adults, where they're just climbing out of the car all bloody, and 2-3 weeks later they're buying a new car and they're driving again. Too many people that have gotten away with damaging stuff, and just nothing happening. There's nothing happened. There's no consequence, so they're not stop. They don't have a reason to stop.
And it's a very, very sad commentary for our people and our government to overlook the tribes and be marginalized because of the top-down jurisdiction of available funds. To me, that is very contradictory to the Constitution.
The next place I went was North Dakota, which I was hoping would be a good news story, because this was an area I went to. Actually, it's where Senator Dorgan's from. I went to the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. And this is an area of the country, in just 5 years, the Bakken oil formation has gone from, in North Dakota, has gone from producing about 200,000 barrels to 1.1 million barrels of oil a day, making North Dakota the #2 oil-producing state behind Texas. But there was a dark side to this multi-billion-dollar boom in the oil fields, and you can sort of see this is all the traffic going into the reservation. The arrival of these highly paid oil workers living in sprawling man camps with limited spending opportunities led to a crime wave, including murders, assaults, rapes, human trafficking, and it was all fueled by a huge demand for heroin and meth. And especially hard hit were the Indian lands at the heart of the Bakken. This is Fort Berthold, home to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, known as the MHA Nation. And can you go to the next slide? Yes. This is Dawn White. Senator Dorgan and I were just talking about her. And I saw this story mostly through her eyes. And here she is. She's burning sage to put on for luck and to keep her safe as she patrolled the reservation. And she, so I spent time with her, and then the next slide, I spent time with, this is Rochelle Baker, a former meth and heroin addict on the reservation, a young mother who, when I interviewed her, was facing up to 56 months in jail on drug charges. And Dawn White told me about the Native American grandparents who raised her, and about how she was missing spending time with her 3 children because of all the time she was spending as a cop on the reservation. And I'm just going to read to you something she said to me one day. Quote, "I sacrifice because this is the only place I'm going to be a cop, the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation." And she said that she had tears in her eyes. "This is the last of what my people have. Our people have survived so many things in history. The meth use, the heroin use is just another epidemic like smallpox and boarding schools. And the last of the last are going to have to survive. And I want to be in the front lines because that was my vow to protect my people." And finally, the last thing I'm going to show you about is Nikki and I, Nikki Kahn, Pulitzer Prize winning photographer. She's now a documentary filmmaker. She made this journey with me. And we went to Pine Ridge and to examine the problems in the broken juvenile justice system in Indian country. And Nikki, you want to come up and talk a little bit about that, and then we'll show you a video.
So Sarah did this wonderful story, and I got to tag along and be her photographer. And one of the things we talked about in the final piece was the juvenile justice. And so in the federal system, there's no juvenile division, no court judges, rehab facilities, or probation for juveniles. And from 1999 through 2008, as many as 60% of juveniles in the federal custody were American Indians, according to a commission. They recommended that I'm blanking. I'm sorry.
That's okay. But part of the thing that we found going there is we were so inspired by these people.
Totally. We had Pine Ridge's Attorney General, Tati Means, who'd gotten her degree, law degree, and come back. Heather Thompson, who's here today, worked as an attorney and came back to serve her community. The kids that we met in this video that you'll see were themselves really inspiring. Tony Ghostfeather, and Shauna. I'll play the video for you, and you'll get a sense of what it was like to grow up on Pine Ridge.
I met some people like going through riskier stuff than me. Kids looking for kind of you just see our natives standing up there. You see alcohol everywhere, and that's sad.
Pine Ridge in South Dakota is the second biggest reservation in the United States. Larger than Delaware and Rhode Island combined, covering more than 2.7 million acres of grasslands where buffalo still breathe. But the Oglala Lakota people living here are racked by 87% unemployment, and many live in crippling poverty. Pine Ridge and neighboring Rosebud reservations are located in two of the poorest counties in America. Alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic violence, and sexual abuse are all issues that the tribe faces. Indian children are twice as likely as any other ethnicity to die before the age of 24, according to the Indian Law and Order Commission. And often on these remote reservations, mental health services are hard to come by, leaving young people like Shauna Thornton on their own.
I went through depression from what happened with me and my father. Whenever he would get drunk, I would just decide to just leave the house.
So I spent a year chronicling all these challenges in Indian country and others, but we have to wrap it up now, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But as Nikki said, along this journey, we were inspired by the extraordinary people we met. And I'm so flattered. Thank you for asking us here today, because the Center for Native American Youth, created by Senator Dorgan, is such an impressive effort to address these challenges and others and continue to bring about positive change. So thank you.
Sari, thank you very, very much. And Nikki, thank you as well. You know, so many of these stories are sad and difficult, and yet other portions of those stories are about courage, resilience, inspiration. So thank you very much. I so admire your work, and can't tell you how important it has been. Next, let me introduce to you the director of the Center for Native American Youth. You know, Erin Bailey was here for a long while. She's now moved to Minnesota, but we were really, really pleased to be able to hire Eric Stegman. Eric, would you?
Hello. I'm going to ask our panelists if I have you come on up here and join me up on the stage. And Senator Dorgan, if you want to sit at the other end there too. My name is Eric Stegman. I'm the executive director here, and it's really an honor to have you all here with us for our annual Native American Heritage Month event. Oh, aha! Now you can hear me better, hopefully. Is that right? Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. So my family's from the Carry the Kettle Dakota First Nation up in Saskatchewan, and I've really had the honor of being the director here for the last almost 2 years now. And I first want to thank our amazing staff here for everything that came together today, particularly this beautiful report. A special shout out to Bettina Gonzalez on our staff, who did a lot of work actually pulling together this gorgeous report for us. So thank you, Bettina. And then I'd also like to thank the other members of our team who helped with our event and everything else here today. Aaron Slater, Amber Richardson, Del Kerfman, and Josie Raffalito, who is no longer with us. She actually just moved on, so a lot of you I know knew Josie, who had been here since the very beginning of CNAY, so thank you to the staff. I also want to thank Sari for joining us today and sharing that great work that she's done throughout Indian country. And we know that there's a lot of challenges out there in Indian country for Native youth, but what I'm really excited about and honored with this panel here today is to really hear directly from several different communities about the amazing things that Native youth are doing to tackle those challenges and the resilience that they're building through the initiatives that they're leading. And that's really what this entire report is about. I hope you take some time to flip through there and see some of the great work that's happening on the ground that we learn about every year here at the Center for Native American Youth. So what I'm going to do is just ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. We also have a sheet on your chair that gives you a little bit of a bio of them. But to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you're doing to engage other Native youth in your communities around the issues that matter to you. So Sam, we'll start with you.
All right, well, thank you. My name is Sam Schimmel. I'm from St. Lawrence Island, Alaska, and Kenai, Alaska. So I'm Siberian Yupik Eskimo and Kanaitse Indian. I've been living in Seattle, going to school down there. And so I've been working with communities around Alaska as trying to engage youth around our state to make change for youth. So I've been working, it actually started here with your guys' organization, with being a Center for Native American Youth Champion for Change in 2017. And we, as part of that program, as part of the CNA program, when you're recognized as a Champion for Change, they bring you to Capitol Hill and you meet with your representatives in Congress and in the Senate. And in one of those meetings with my Senator Murkowski, we had gotten to talking about youth improvement opportunities, and the topic of the Alice Spotted Bear and Walter Soboleff Commission on Native Children came up. And I looked, after that meeting, I got more involved with that commission. And so I wanted to put together a program that kind of touched on the issues that that commission is supposed to touch on, such as suicide, drug abuse, alcoholism, and cultural disconnectedness in Native youth communities. And so as part of that, I was traveling around Alaska during this past year. I was traveling around to Native villages and meeting with youth from around our state about those issues. And, well, one thing that came up in all of those meetings was something that Sherry touched on in your story, is that intergenerational trauma that we all face. It's not usually referred to that in Indian country. It's touched on as things like alcoholism or suicide was one of your things I saw you touched on. But surrounding that issue and meeting with all of these Native youth to get their collective voice and bring it back to DC and bring it back to our representatives, I realized that the best way to get youth, the voice of youth, to the representatives is to bring our federal delegation right to youth. So I had organized a panel with the Alaska Federation of Natives. For those of you who are not from Alaska or do not know what that is, it's a yearly gathering in February where natives from around the state of Alaska come together and meet either in Anchorage or in Fairbanks to talk about the issues that are plaguing their communities. And so as part of that, I decided that I wanted to get our federal delegation, so our senators, our congressmen, and our governor together to sit down at a roundtable discussion with our Native youth. And we were able to do that, luckily, thanks to some of the staff at their offices and to the dedication of our delegation. But I was able to put together a panel where I put our governor, our senators, Senator Murkowski and Sullivan, and our Congressman Young in front of Native youth. We put them in a roundtable discussion, and we were able to talk about things that plague us, that intergenerational trauma, that suicide, that drug abuse, that alcoholism, that cultural disconnectedness. And we came to the conclusion in that meeting that the roots of our problems and the roots of all of these issues that come up are based in cultural disconnectedness. The idea that we've seen time and time again, no matter where I go in Alaska, and no matter what Indian communities I visit, I see that when kids are not connected to their culture, when communities are not rooted in their culture, the children and the whole community turns to things like alcoholism. So really my big thing that I've been working on is trying to connect youth with culture.
Great, thank you, Sam. And it was really incredible to get the photos back from Alaska, because we couldn't believe you had the whole delegation there. And that was actually the focus of our report last year, too. So I'm next going to ask Anthony, if you couldn't tell by his beadwork where he's from, to go ahead and introduce himself. Anthony?
Yeah, so my name's Anthony Tamez. I'm First Nations, Wessosippic Cree, and Chichangu Lakota. And I'm from the city of Chicago. I was born there. I live on the north side in Albany Park. And what I work around, and what also my youth council works around, Chi Nations, is like environmental problems and mainly the mascot issue. Coming from Chicago, we have the NHL team, the Blackhawks. So we had to go to school every day, and that's all anyone ever wears. So like we're constantly seeing that image. So in 2012, that's when our youth council was created. And our mission was to create safe space for Native youth through arts, activism, and education. And through that, that's when a lot of us started getting, we started educating ourselves on like the mascot issue. So fast forward a couple years, I took the Gen I challenge, and that was getting race-based mascots outside of, or getting them out of Chicago public schools. So getting it to where students wouldn't be able to wear their shirts with Indian logos on it or Native imagery that's offensive to us. So I started in my school, Von Steuben, and I started talking to the administration, and each year our the vice principal or whoever I was talking to, they had left and they went to a different school. So that's kind of hard for me. So then I just scrapped that idea, and then I started working just like with my classmates. So I started educating them. I started talking to them about why it's offensive, what they can do. And a lot of them listened. And through it, I just learned that people are just, they just don't know. And to be able to sit down and just have a conversation with somebody instead of like yelling at them it's very effective. But yeah.
Thank you, Anthony. And I especially appreciate what Anthony's work. It says a lot about the kinds of work that we see going on at the school environment all across the country, and look forward to talking to you a little bit more about your initiative. Kaylee joins us from down in New Mexico. Would you like to introduce yourself, Kaylee?
In the Tewa language, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Kaylee Warren. I'm from the state of New Mexico. I am Tewa and Tiwa Pueblo from the villages of Santa Clara and Isleta. I'm a student at the University of New Mexico. I also serve the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico as a sitting member of the All Pueblo Council of Governors Natural Resources Committee and Greater Chaco Landscape Subcommittee. I am the co-founder and the former chairwoman of the Santa Clara Pueblo Youth Council. I am a youth representative of the Communities for Clean Water Coalition, which seeks to protect frontline communities like mine from the effects of nuclear weapons manufacturing in New Mexico. I am also a co-founder and a lead organizer with the Diné Pueblo Youth Solidarity Coalition, which is a group that I created with other young women who are from the Pueblo villages of New Mexico, but also the Eastern Navajo Agency in New Mexico to protect our sacred sites and community wellness from extractive industries, especially fracking and oil and gas in the state of New Mexico.
Great, thank you. And we have a great call-out box in the report about their coalition, too, so please do read up about that. And finally, we have Chrissy Castro from Los Angeles, who was actually just recently on an Indigenous Peoples Day episode of the NPR program 1A with our colleague Amber over here. So happy to have you here, Chrissy, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chrissy Castro. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm Nakai Dene, born for the One Who Walks Around clan. Born and raised in Los Angeles. My grandparents came to Los Angeles during the relocation period. And it wasn't until graduate school that I feel I got a very in-depth education about the history of U.S. federal Indian policy and realized that the experiences that I had as a young person, the experiences of my family and my community, were not isolated, but they were part of a very much connected experience because of U.S. federal Indian policy. And I felt very determined that I wanted to make sure that our young people had that knowledge earlier on so they could engage and make a difference in the issues that they cared about. And so out of school, I started to do a lot of youth community organizing, a lot of political education of Native youth, co-founded something called United Native Youth Los Angeles. And since then have been working in community organizing, civic and voter engagement, political participation across generations and in a lot of various communities across the country. So I'm here as a representative of the Native Voice Network, of Advanced Native Political Leadership, of the California Native Vote Project, and I'm also the vice chair at home of the LA City County Indian Commission.
Great, thank you, Chrissy. And Chrissy and I actually got to spend some time together out at Standing Rock last year together with the Native Voice Network, which was a great experience. So, Senator Dorgan, you want to kick off our conversation?
Well, it's really interesting to listen to what you're doing. When you're done talking, I'm out of breath. That's a lot. You're just you're kind of an interesting answer to what we see, what we know, the videos and so on, the dysfunction. You're an interesting answer to that because you are young people who are at a very early age still have begun to get very, very involved. Sam, it's probably audacious for you to decide, okay, how old are you?
17. Yeah, 17.
Yeah, 17. You're getting up there, you know that? But here's a 17-year-old saying to Senator Murkowski and the governor and others, we need to have you here to get a sense to answer some questions for us. And good for you. You have to be a little audacious to make things happen. And Chrissy, you grew up, and I did, observing Columbus Day for the guy that discovered America. sort of strange, isn't it? And you're working, I think, aren't you, on Indigenous Peoples Day as opposed to Columbus Day? Because he didn't, Columbus. I was in Seville, Spain, or Seville, I guess, Spain, and went to the church where he was supposedly entombed. But then, and it was Christopher Columbus. But then when I left there, they said, "But we're not really sure that it was him." So they've got a tomb. They got a tomb there, but they're not sure they got the right guy in the tomb. But anyway, he apparently discovered America. Except he didn't discover anything. You were still here. So you're doing Indigenous Peoples Day, and so you're all just doing really interesting things. Tony, what would you say to Dan Snyder about his Washington football team?
I'm not sure. I'd call it racist first, and I'd ask him, I guess, why? Like, why do you think that this is honoring Native people when you're told time and again from Native people that it's racist and that it's offensive to us?
Yeah, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing, because this is another issue that we hear about all over the country, and I think a lot of folks don't understand why it matters so much. But it's really important to hear directly from Native youth about this issue, and it's one of those things that we hear no matter what the community, that there's a lot going on at the local level, and I think a lot of times people don't see it nationally. One of the other quotes that was really interesting to me in the report is we were just at a roundtable on Indian education in New Mexico, hosted with us in our Education and Society program, and one of the students there was sharing about their perspectives on youth organizing. And he said that this is really a renaissance for Native youth organizing, that there's just this explosion of activity going on out there. And I was wondering if any of you on the panel want to share with us, do you agree? Do you think that this is kind of a new moment for Native youth in organizing and reaching out to one another?
Well, when I was in Alaska, I had put together that panel, and I just remember we're sitting around in a circle of chairs, and the governor's sitting next to me, our senators on one end, our congressman's on the other, and then we have another senator that's coming in the door. And we had a very respected elder, Bob Sams, that was with us that day to give us an opening prayer and participate in the discussions. And he had stood up right before he had to leave, and he had said, "This is truly amazing what you have done here. For this to happen, it is amazing. In my lifetime, I never thought this would happen. Just 20 years ago, not even 20, but 10 years ago," he said, "this could never have happened. The federal representatives of Alaska would not have all gathered in the same room to meet with Native youth." So really, it is just amazing the opportunities that are opening up to us today with leaders being willing to engage with youth, not only Native youth, but youth in general. So, yes.
Let me just mention that we have normally had reservation occupants here on panels. The kids that grow up on Indian reservations, and Sari and Nikki displayed that on the screen as well. But we have substantial populations of Native American youth, Native Americans generally living in urban areas. And this is the first time we've had an opportunity to talk a lot about that. But how difficult is it to be able to get groups together in a major city, for example, and help develop some thoughts about leadership capabilities there? Chrissy, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, I can start, and I'm sure others can add to this. But it poses a challenge around traditional community organizing, which typically is geographic focused. If you look at the relocation programs, which are responsible for the creation of these large urban indigenous communities, we know that the local satellite BAA offices intentionally placed our families away from each other. So what you see in urban communities is a geographic dispersion of our community. There's not an urban Indian geographical center for the most part. So traditional organizing tactics of door knocking or showing up at the market to talk to people on their way out, things, you can't go to a place necessarily to be able to connect to all those people. So we rely on a lot of innovative things. We go to community events and so forth, but still there's not really a way to reach out to every Native family. So there's a lot of social isolation that we experience, and that makes it very difficult. With Native Youth LA, United Native Youth LA, There was also a huge transportation budget for that reason. LA being as big as it is, we were shuttling kids. They would travel for 2 hours to get to a youth meeting. Our budget was $40,000 a year for transportation, and that's really hard to sustain. So although we were able to overcome incredible odds, there are a lot of challenges with organizing in an urban context for Indigenous peoples.
And then living in Chicago, we have all of these organizations. We have like the American Indian Center, which is the community center for our organization or our city. And then we have things like Title VII that are inside of CPS that work with Native youth. And one of the big things that I notice, like with every Native organization in the city of Chicago, is that like they want to be the best. They want to have the most, they want to have the most Native youth, or they want to have the most people come to their events. So it's like a lot of fighting amongst each other. And it's what I think we need to do is, instead of fighting with each other, work together, because that really divides the community. And when we have just certain people going to this event and not going to this event because they don't like that people, it tears us apart, and it makes it forces the youth to you have to pick sides. And it's like you want to go to all of these things because you know all of these people, they're your community, but it's just. I guess that's just how it's always been, since our parents.
Kaylee, one of the things I was talking with you at lunch about was a discussion we actually had back in New Mexico. And what I find really interesting about what's happening down in New Mexico is how all of your youth leaders there are working with your elected tribal leadership and other elected leadership. And can you tell us a little bit about some of how that's playing out and some of the new things that are developing as platforms for Native youth?
Yeah, so in New Mexico, we're sort of just starting our engagement as far as creating youth councils, being part of the larger youth leadership network. I think a lot of times we get very isolated in New Mexico, and it is absolutely a vastly different environment than the rest of the country. So for us, a lot of our initiatives are very new, but one of those initiatives that I find particularly inspiring and something that I understand is pretty unique as far as how tribal government engages with Native youth is something that I get to be part of as a sitting youth member of 2 committees with the All Pueblo Council of Governors. So in New Mexico, there are 19 pueblos. There's 1 pueblo in Texas. But all of our governors come together in a collaborative organization called the All Pueblo Council of Governors, and it's a space where, although each pueblo is its own sovereign nation with its own government, all of the pueblos come together to form sort of a unified voice and to speak out as pueblo nations. Because although we're different and we're separated, we still very much rely on one another. And what that's looked like before has just been our governors, who in most cases are in office traditionally. In the pueblos, we still have traditional electoral systems, which sometimes do not constitute voting or elections per se. Our leaders are traditionally selected and put into office for a term of 1 year. And they all come together in that space to work together. And typically, up till this point, it's just been them. And that does create some gaps we've seen in communication, particularly between leadership and community members. And that's problematic because there are issues that are concerning to us in communities, and we don't really get to hear about them because our leadership are so busy handling it themselves. So this year, what happened was we are in the middle of a very tense moment in New Mexico with our situation as far as extractive industry, particularly in the Chaco Canyon area, the Four Corners area of the Southwest. And in January, there was a large sale of land to be used for fracking, to be drilled for oil. And it was really out of the blue. to us in the community, because suddenly there were more than 20 parcels of land, which are hundreds of acres, that were just sold. And everybody was kind of like, how did this happen? We didn't know about this until it had already happened. And it wasn't just us in the communities, it was our leadership as well. And that's something that we experience a lot in New Mexico, is we don't necessarily find out about things until they've already happened. And what happened was my youth council, the Santa Clara Pueblo Youth Council, went before the All Pueblo Council of Governors and told them, we're very concerned. This has happened, we lost a lot of land. And we wanted them to know that we were afraid for our future, that we were afraid for our culture, because our land is what ties us to our spirituality, and what really makes it possible for us as youth to build a future for ourselves. And when we went before our council, it was the first time that a group of youth had ever approached all of the governors at once. And it was really a wake-up call, I think, for them. And what came out of that was the creation of my position, and also the position for another young woman from my pueblo, to where we are now the first youth to ever be able to get to sit on committees, and to have an impact within those committees in supporting the work, but also taking that work into the community and bridging that gap in communication that previously existed. So what's happening in New Mexico right now with the All Pueblo Council of Governors as the leader is a new era in tribal leadership, where youth are working alongside our elected leaders in uplifting their work, but also translating that work into methods that are more accessible. So we take a lot of it to social media. We do a lot of community engagement efforts. And it's really an intergenerational working relationship in which we are striving to protect what is ours, to conserve our future, and make sure that we're all thriving.
Thanks so much. It's amazing. Really inspiring work out there. Before we go over to the audience, I just wanted to throw one additional question to just anyone who wants to answer. This entire report this year really focuses on civic identity, and I think one of the things that we've heard from our youth leaders is that civic identity for Native people is different. And there's a lot of different ways that Native youth are engaging each other across the country. But can any of you tell us what civic engagement means to you, especially from sort of a cultural perspective?
To me, it's really about reclaiming space. I think we see a lot that it's becoming more apparent that there are a lot of systems that just weren't made for Native people to be involved, that weren't made to see us succeed, that were not made to even see us alive. And for me, civic engagement, especially as a young Native person, is about asserting our belonging and our worth in this country that has been built on top of our nations. And, as was already said, that does mean that you have to sometimes be audacious. You have to put yourself out there. And you have to be strong in your beliefs. And culturally, that's relevant because I think, at least where I'm from, we're raised to be strong. We're raised with values of protecting others, of putting others before yourself, and a value of sacrifice. And civic engagement, I think, as a Native youth, you should be strong in your core values, and make sure that you're doing what you can to ensure that you're securing a future for your people.
Kaylee, you are wise way beyond your years. Let me just ask one additional question about homelessness, particularly in the cities of Native Americans. At the moment I'm writing a book about a young woman, Native American youth, who was homeless in Minneapolis for some while. And she described to me that people see you on the streets, but they really don't notice you at all. It's as if you're not there. you come from urban areas, Los Angeles and Chicago. Is homelessness a significant problem for Native youth or Native Americans in an urban area?
For youth, I'm not too sure about, but I know that we have not a large number of homeless people, but like before the Indian Center moved, it used to be closer to the lake, and every day when we would travel, I'd see a group of homeless Native people under the train tracks, and like seeing that, it kind of broke my heart, and there wasn't much I can do, but like except have a conversation with them. So, right. Like my aunt and me, we'd hop off the bus, we'd maybe buy them something to eat or give them whatever we had, and just talk to them. But one of them was my grandpa's friend. His name was Elmer Tucrow, and he died one summer of exposure because it was too hot, and so they found him on the back steps, face first. So that was kind of like hearing those stories. It kind of breaks my heart, and like I know there's people in the city working around homelessness, but.
Chrissy, do you have?
So I think with the gentrification and as we're seeing, there's a rise in homelessness and with the lack of housing for many communities, and I think Native communities are most heavily impacted. And unfortunately, because we don't have accurate data and statistics, it's also a very invisible problem. And so, should I go ahead?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. So yes, it is a huge problem, and I think it's one of these things that is devastating because we're the first peoples of these lands, yet we're the most impacted by not having homes. And I think it's a huge challenge. Our community just had a community forum after we won. We changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day in the city and county of LA this year, which I'm so excited about. A clap for our community. And we had a forum shortly thereafter to talk about, okay, we have had this level of organization and unity in our community that we want to continue to build upon, and we're working on changing the educational curriculum in the state of California and these other issues, but housing and homelessness was another of one of the 4 priority issues and something that we're going to be turning our attention to. Yep.
I know, so Anchorage, Alaska, it's kind of the biggest city there. But when you go around Anchorage, you always see a disproportionate number of homeless natives. And you see a huge stigma around the homeless native population. I remember sitting in a history class, actually, in Anchorage, and one of the kids in the class, the issue of homelessness came up. And she said, they're always dirty. We always have to look out for the natives. They're always dirty and they're always homeless. And that kind of that struck me as there's really nothing being done right now to right these wrongs. You have children in this education system, children that live in this city, and that children who have native friends are saying that the natives are dirty because they're homeless. Or my uncle, Kevin, he, again, kind of like your story, you see there isn't really that outreach. The only outreach that you see to these homeless native communities are usually from churches. And I remember he was addicted to huffing gas, and he had passed away in a park, and they hadn't found him for 3 or 4 days. And he had passed away in the park because he couldn't get housing. He had died, he had frozen to death, actually, because he was not able to find somewhere warm to live. So just that really strikes me, and it's not a isolated incident. You see in Indian country, you see the things that bind us together whenever you go anywhere. It's not our culture, it's not our common experiences of subsistence hunting or fishing. It's far too often, it's that intergenerational trauma and those other afflictions that we face as Native people, which I think is really one of the major things that is a struggle.
And the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And I really appreciate what you said too, because I think a lot of folks don't understand the connections that happen then in the classroom with these problems not being dealt with, and how representations of our communities matter with other people, especially non-Native folks. So really appreciate your remarks. We're going to go ahead and open it up to the audience. So if you've got a question for any of our panelists, if you could just raise your hand and then let us know who you are and where you come from. It would be great, please.
Here, can you do this?
Hi, I'm Jaya Lunt with Generations United, and we are an organization that focuses on connecting the generations. And we are home to the National Center on Grand Families, which is what we affectionately call families where grandparents and other relatives are raising children. And I just had a question for you. I know that in the beginning presentation there was a mention of a young woman who was raised by her grandmother, and just wanted to check in on the degree which you see grandparents stepping in to care for young people when their parents can't, and any insights you have into what would be particularly supportive of grand families in Indian country. And just mention that we have an initiative where that we're just launching. We're looking to elevate the voices of those caregivers in Indian country that are raising grandchildren, and we'd love to partner with really visible, powerful young voices in that initiative.
Well, in Gamble, one of the communities that I'm from, you see parents, so the generation that probably 30 to 45 years old, they've, for whatever reasons, I think it's because their parents were taken away from boarding schools and then were not able to raise them traditionally. You see that their kids, the kids my age and younger than I am, staying a lot with their grandparents because their grandparents are able to provide a stable environment to raise children. And you see a lot, especially in my community. I remember my young cousin, Eastu. Her mother had been murdered, actually. But she had been staying, we call it, I forget the Eskimo word, but it's kind of a grandparent adoption, not really, so that she had been adopted by my great uncle, Raymond. And what had happened, you see this, it's one of the better things that we see in our community where our grandparents or the elders take in young children. Again, in Native communities, the idea of the nuclear family is kind of foreign. It's more of a community that raises the children. You see, if you're from a very rural Native community, you always know that you're always over at auntie's house or grandma's house or uncle's house a lot of the time. And so what happens is there's kind of a disconnectedness between our community values and the values of our government. So his caretaking, my uncle's caretaking of my young cousin, was not recognized as a legal adoption in the law. So she actually had to be removed from the community. So trying to bridge that gap and allow for traditions to be allowed by law, that's like what we really want to work on, especially around adoption and children. So.
Yeah, well, I guess just real quick, kind of going off of that. So, like I live with my aunts in Chicago. So I think like beyond your grandparents, like my grandpa does live with us, but it's also like your aunties and uncles that take care of you. It's, I think that's just the way it's always been in Native families. It's like the idea of Native parenting, and similar to his story, like living with my aunts, people don't they don't view that as I guess they're not technically my guardians to the law, but yeah.
And I'm really glad, thanks for both of your insights, and I'm really glad you asked that, because that's one of the questions we ask in our national online survey. We're actually going to be developing some specific resources on that, because the write-ins that we got from Native youth across the country about who raised them, I think said a lot about the communities that we come from. So very great, good question. Other questions? I recognize you.
Hello, I'm Faith Russell, and a proud parent of a former champion and also a proud parent of an employee of CNAY. So it's really being with family right now. I'm also the president of the board of the Association on American Indian Affairs. And our family, because of my life choice, coming from the reservation at Navajo Nation and relocating here, I've spent my career in this area. And I know it's been very challenging in the urban area, and especially since we were always the only Native family. But in my experience, and I guess I'd really like to ask the young people here, what is your advice, or what would you say to build allies in understanding your communities and the issues you're facing and everything we've learned about and know about? Because in my experience, and something that is just amazing with the Washington Post series, is that it exposed Indian country to so many other people that would have absolutely no idea that Indian nations still exist. But if you were to sit across the table, or if we were all young people that were non-Indian, what would you say to us to really say the most important thing that you find in your lives, or what would we do to be an ally, or just what would you say to us? Because I think, as you know, you have your tribal communities, but everybody out there is non-tribal beyond.
Great question.
A lot of the time I get people tell me is, you don't look Native, and so that's a big issue for me. So I'm Native and Black, so a lot of the time just walking down the street, people look at me and they say, oh, there's just a little black boy. But I'm Native and Black, so that's who I am. And the idea of what Natives look like can kind of be connected with like the mascot issue. So a lot of the times people say, oh, well, you don't look like how we see Indians. So I'd say just like changing the way you think of what a Native is, and a lot of the times living in the city, like going to grade schools, like kids ask, oh, well, do you live in a teepee still? And as serious as the matter is, it's just funny to me, because I have to say, oh no, I live in an apartment just like you. I live here, and it's just, I guess, education and informing yourself.
Again, kind of building off that education premise. Like yesterday, I was meeting with Ron from the education department, and we got to the topic of education on Native issues and Native identities. And I was telling him about how I remember in 4th grade, my teacher decided that she was going to start off a lesson on Indians. And she had a picture of a teepee and a picture of an igloo up on her board. And she had her meter stick and pointed at the teepee and said, this is where Indians live. All Indians live in teepees. And then pointed at the igloo and said, this is where Eskimos live. And I remember I stood up as a 4th grader and I said, respectfully, that's not true. Eskimos don't live in igloos. Indians don't live in teepees. I have Indian friends that live in houses just next to me. One of my classmates over here, Johnny, he's from the Tlingit Nation. He doesn't live in a teepee, and he never traditionally lived in a teepee. He lived in a longhouse. And I remember I got suspended for telling her that not all natives live in teepees, and not all Eskimos live in igloos. And so it's really that rooted in education. And so all my classmates, if I had not stood up, they would have accepted, okay, you wear a headdress, you wear war paint, you live in a teepee. That's an Indian. There's no Indians here anymore. You wear a giant seal jacket, which I am today, but you wear gummocks, you eat seals raw, and you live in an igloo. So kind of bridging that gap between, or not bridging that gap, but educating both our educators and our students and young leaders about what Native actually looks like. So just coming back to that education premise.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways I could describe the contemporary Indigenous experience in largely non-Native spaces is you get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You get asked awkward questions. You have to explain things that to you are just sort of inherent. And for me, most of my life I've been, despite coming from a state with a lot of Native people, for most of my education, I've been the only Native person in my school. And I've gotten used to that dynamic. I've gotten used to being in on the classroom discussions where, I mean, I'm sure we all have a long line of stories of horrible things that have happened to us in classrooms, but, you know, I've gotten the nobody cares about the fact your people were murdered. I've gotten the, you know, Indians are dead, why are you talking about them, you're not Indian. And I think for me, I am just, there's a quote that I like that is, my love for my people is stronger than anybody else's hate or misunderstanding, you know. And for me, it's all about being rooted in how I was raised and my culture and my beliefs and loving that above everything else. And so when I come into a space, I start with language. Just so like I started today, I introduced myself in my language. I provided a greeting, my clans, the village I'm from, my name. And I would advise that as the ultimate starting point. Even if all you know is hello in your language, that's a good place to start because it establishes what is important to you and who you are up front. And it differentiates you in a good way because it shows that you come from a background that is different and is blessed. So that would be my advice, is to start with language and just to know where you come from, whether that be a city or if it's a reservation, where you come from, and knowing that you represent not only yourself and your family, but every person who sacrificed to make it possible for you to be alive.
Well, on that powerful note, that was a wonderful note to end on. Did you have something to say?
Well, I just would say, the four of you give me great hope. I mean, I'm so impressed with what you're doing and with your optimism and positive view of how you make a world a better place. So you just give me great hope. To those of you in the audience who've come today to be a part of this, thanks for doing that. Thanks for caring. There are just too many people that don't care. More have to, and working on these issues with Native American youth, just putting all the spotlights on the same spot, saying, what are we going to do? We're going to start with kids, Native American kids, and see if that builds an opportunity, if those ripples of hope build a mighty current. And I'm convinced it is, and it does, and it will. We created the Champions for Change program here at the Center for Native American Youth for a very specific purpose. There's a lot of bad news out there, there's no question about that, but we intend to find the good news and celebrate it as well. And you can go tribe by tribe across this country. We have 550 or so tribes, and you ask them, who's doing what in your tribe that gives you great hope and inspiration for the future? And they'll nominate kids, young adults and kids who are doing unbelievable things. Just brings tears to your eyes to think, that sort of seekers against the wind, right? They're running against the wind because they're changing things. And so I just want to say thanks. Thanks for coming and telling us your perspective and your story. It's really nice of you to do that. And then let me say thanks to Eric and to the staff that works with us here at Center for Native American Youth for making a difference, because I believe every day that we're finding ways to improve lives and strengthen lives and help change the fortunes of Native American youth. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much to our panelists who are traveling from all the different parts of the country to be here with us today. And if you have any questions, we'll be around about the report afterwards. It's also available online. We'll be coming out with additional products about our survey in the forthcoming months. So please reach out with any questions. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Hey.